Chicago's self-described cemetery lady Helen Sclair called herself an advocate for the dead. On December 16th, she joined the ranks of those she represented. Sclair was a walking encyclopedia of Chicago area history as told through its cemeteries. 2 years ago, she gave our Geoffrey Baer a loving and sometimes lighthearted tour of Chicago's cemetery history for our series, Hidden Chicago. Here's another look at that story.
This looks like a pretty ordinary parking lot, but when the Chicago History Museum started building it in 1998, they first had to remove dozens of buried bodies with the help of an archaeologist. That's because the site of the garage in Chicago's Lincoln Park was once part of Chicago's city cemetery. The cemetery was closed in the 1860s, and all the bodies were supposed to have been moved to other cemeteries. Officially, only one grave remains in Lincoln Park. It's the tomb of Ira Couch, an early Chicago pioneer who built the fancy Tremont House Hotel and died a wealthy man. The tomb was either too heavy to move, or the Couch family wanted too much compensation from the city to move it. So the Couch Mausoleum is the only grave left in Lincoln Park?
The only visible grave is the Couch Mausoleum. There may be thousands of bodies still left.
Helen Sclair calls herself Chicago's cemetery lady. She's made a career out of finding out where Chicago's bodies are buried, and some of those places will really surprise you. For example, long before our famous water tower was built in 1869, this was the site of Chicago's very first town cemetery. Now, there certainly aren't any bodies left there.
Oh,
right?
For pity sakes. When every time they dig a sewer or a street or a basement or anything they want to dig in that particular land, all of those fancy stores and all of those...
On North Michigan Avenue?
Yes, yes. All the way up to the Drake. It was the first formal burial site in the city of Chicago.
By 1843, Chicago had grown from a frontier town into a city, and the new cemetery opened north of North Avenue in today's Lincoln Park. The Jewish community bought just under an acre of that land for their use, and a Catholic cemetery was established just south of City Cemetery. So this is where the Gold Coast is today?
Oh, yes, sir. Mm-hmm. And are there bodies there? Oh, yes, sir. I'm pretty sure you're going to find a substantial number, just like a dear old water tower.
Thousands of those buried in City Cemetery were Confederate prisoners from the Civil War. They had died in a prisoner of war camp on Chicago's South Side, right along the lakefront at 35th Street. It was called Camp Douglas because the property had belonged to Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who was Abraham Lincoln's opponent in a series of famous debates in 1858. Douglas died in 1861, and his property became a Civil War training camp. Later, POWs were shipped there via the Illinois Central, which bordered the property. Douglas himself is entombed under a towering column on the site today, but the ground was too low and waterlogged to bury the thousands of Confederate prisoners who died in miserable conditions at the camp.
Now imagine carrying those bodies across the city, approximately 7 miles, all the way to City Cemetery.
Unfortunately, the topography in City Cemetery, now Lincoln Park, was not much better, and some mourners started complaining.
In City Cemetery, due to their proximity to the shore of Lake Michigan, they could dig only to a depth of 3 feet, and this was not something that pleased them at all.
What was the problem with that?
Because odors from the bodies, it was rather unpleasant to visit the grave.
In addition, the growing city was now encroaching on the cemetery land.
In 1858, a gentleman, Dr. Rauch, began publicly speaking about burying where people lived, that this was a health hazard. They called them miasmas, with great vapors that arose from all this mess. Okay. And he kept screaming about this.
The Catholics saw the writing on the wall and started removing bodies from their cemetery. The Cardinal's stately mansion now stands on part of that property. It was completed in 1880. That was the same year the Archdiocese said it had finished moving all the bodies to Calvary Cemetery in Evanston and St. Boniface in Chicago. Both were located on higher ground along the old Green Bay Trail. This old Indian trail, now called Clark Street, followed a ridge that in prehistoric times was the shore of a much larger Lake Michigan. So you need high ground, basically. Right?
Yes, you do. You need higher ground. You need ground so that when you dig the grave, it doesn't fill up immediately with water. That is very unpleasant to look upon if you're going to put your loved one in a bathtub of water.
But the final nail in the coffin of City Cemetery wasn't its low-lying location. It was when Chicago discovered it actually didn't own part of the land due to a botched sales contract. In 1866, a massive relocation began to move all of the bodies to new cemeteries that had been built outside the city limits. One of them, Graceland, in the Lakeview neighborhood, was built along the same Indian trail as St. Boniface and Calvary, Green Bay Road, now called Clark Street. Many of Chicago's elite were laid to rest here, including Marshall Field, Bertha and Potter Palmer, and George Pullman, along with many Chicago mayors and Illinois governors. You'll also find important architects like Daniel Burnham, and more recently, Mies van der Rohe, whose stone reflects his motto, less is more. Businessman Henry Harrison Getty commissioned the great architect Louis Sullivan to design this tomb for his wife Carrie. Sullivan himself is also buried at Graceland. Sullivan's partner, Dankmar Adler, was Jewish. He's buried in Mount Mayrive Cemetery beneath a column from a building he designed, the Central Music Hall. That building was torn down the year Adler died to make room for Marshall Field's State Street store. Today you can still see stones at Mount Mayrive that were moved here from that tiny Jewish cemetery in what is now Lincoln Park. They're among the oldest in the city. But they made one stop along the way to Mount Mayrive at a short-lived Jewish cemetery at Clark and Belmont. By the way, the other entrance column from Dankmar Adler's Central Music Hall is at Rose Hill Cemetery in the Ravenswood neighborhood. It belongs to the man who procured the column for Adler's grave. He kept the other one for his own personal use. Like many of the cemeteries that opened in the late 1800s, Rose Hill was built along a rail line.
And there were cars on streetcars and railroad trains which could handle a body.
Funeral cars.
Funeral cars. They were designed this way so that the body could be slid in on the side and the mourners could travel in the same car.
Rose Hill even had an elevator to take bodies from the train station, which was above grade, down to ground level. Like Graceland, Rose Hill has its share of Chicago mayors and Illinois governors, and even Calvin Coolidge's vice president, Charles Gates Dawes. But all of their monuments are dwarfed by the towering tombstone of colorful early mayor Long John Wentworth. He said he wanted the loftiest tomb in the West. There's also a section here for Civil War dead, which reminds us, what happened to those Confederate POWs buried at City Cemetery? They were moved to a burial mound in Oakwood Cemetery on Chicago's South Side. A monument there lists more than 4,000 names. Faced with relocating thousands of bodies from the lakefront, the city of Chicago apparently decided it was through with cemeteries. A law was passed in 1866 saying there shall never be another cemetery within the Chicago city limits. But when the city annexed 125 square miles of surrounding land in 1889, it became home to cemeteries again. Even if you never visit a Chicago cemetery, remember you're still treading on hallowed ground whenever you shop at Water Tower Place or just take a stroll in Lincoln Park. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Geoffrey Baer.
As the Chicago Tribune pointed out in its obituary, Helen Sclair's address will not change with her death. She lived in an old caretaker's house on the grounds of the Bohemian National Cemetery. She had already chosen a gravesite there and installed a stone. The only thing missing from the inscription was the date of her death. Helen Sclair died December 16th, 2009 at the age of 78. This photo of Miss Sclair is posted on our website.